The winter of 1887 came to Dusty Hollow, Texas, like a debt collector, early, merciless, and without apology. By the first week of December, the plains had turned the color of ash, the creek behind the old mill had frozen solid, and the wind that swept down from the northern territories carried a bite that could crack leather and break spirits in equal measure. It was the kind of cold that made even the hardiest cattle hands question their choices. For Holt, it would become the cold she remembered for the rest of her life. Was 29 years old, and by any honest measure, she was a woman built for better things than the life that had found her. She had wide, dark eyes that still held warmth despite everything, cheekbones that caught the firelight in a way that made people look twice, and hands that, though roughened now by months of labor, still moved with a quiet grace that spoke of the woman she was beneath the circumstances. She was also 7 months pregnant, her belly round and full beneath the second-hand dress she wore, and she moved through the Holt farmhouse each morning with the careful, deliberate steps of someone carrying something precious in a world that had not been particularly careful with her. Thomas Holt had been her husband, a decent, soft-spoken cattle hand with calloused hands, a crooked smile, and a heart that meant well even when his pockets ran empty. He had loved in the straightforward, unspectacular way that good men love steadily and without performance. 3 months ago, on a routine cattle crossing of the swollen Red River, his horse had lost footing in the current. Thomas had not come up from the water. They had found him 2 miles downstream, caught against a tangle of cottonwood roots, his face still wearing the expression of a man who had simply been surprised. Had buried him on a Tuesday, in the frozen ground at the edge of town, with no flowers because nothing was blooming, and no words adequate enough to fill the hole he left behind. What followed was not mourning so much as survival, had nowhere else to go. Her own family was 3 states east and too poor to help. So she stayed in the Holt farmhouse, the small, creaking 2-room structure on the edge of Dusty Hollow where Thomas had grown up, now occupied by his parents, Earl and Ida Holt, who had tolerated her presence the way one tolerates a splinter. Manageable for now, but increasingly irritating with each passing day. Earl Holt was a thick-necked man of 61 with a mustache and eyes the color of muddy river water, flat, suspicious, and always calculating something just behind them. He had never fully approved of, considering her too pretty and too proud for a woman with so little money. Ida was smaller, sharper, a wiry woman whose mouth seemed permanently drawn into the expression of someone who had just smelled something unpleasant. She had a talent for cruelty dressed as concern, for delivering wounds wrapped neatly in the language of propriety. Together, they had been running a quiet scheme that knew nothing about. Thomas, in the final weeks before his death, had visited the land office in town. Quietly, without telling his parents, he had signed over the deed to his 40-acre parcel, a modest stretch of flat land on the northern edge of the Holt property, too. It was not much. Scrubby, dry-looking land that had never yielded anything remarkable. But it was hers legally and completely, and Thomas had tucked the deed inside an envelope along with a letter, pressed it into his hands the morning before the cattle drive, and told her to keep it safe. She had placed it in the bottom of her boot without fully understanding why. Now she understood. Thomas had known something, perhaps not exactly what, but something. Earl and Ida had discovered the deed transfer through the land office clerk, a loose-tongued man who owed Earl a favor. The knowledge had turned them cold in a way that even the Texas winter could not fully account for. That land, they had decided, belonged to the Holt family name, not to a widow who would likely remarry, move away, and take 40 Holt acres with her. Worse still, take a Holt grandchild with her, the one inheritance they had never asked for and did not want. The evening it happened was a Thursday, remembered because she had been counting days the way pregnant women do, measuring time in small, manageable pieces to keep the fear at a distance. She had spent the afternoon mending a shirt by the fire, her back aching, her ankles swollen, the baby pressing heavy and low in a way that the midwife had warned her about. Ida began it, as she always did, with words. You've been seen talking to men in town, Ida said, not looking up from her sewing. People are talking, saying you've got no shame, a widow in your condition making eyes. Kept her voice steady. I buy flour, Ida, I speak to the shopkeeper. Don't you sass me. Ida's needle stabbed the fabric. This is a Christian household. Earl set down his whiskey glass with the slow, deliberate weight of a man who had already decided everything. He rose from his chair, crossed the room, and opened the front door. The night air poured in like ice water, immediate, shocking, total. Get out, he said. His voice carried no anger. Anger would have implied she mattered enough to provoke it. This was something colder. Give birth somewhere else. You and that child are no blood of ours, not anymore. Looked at him, then at Ida, who did not look up. She reached for her shawl. She picked up her small satchel. She felt the thin edge of the deed pressing against the sole of her foot inside her boot, and she held onto that feeling like a handhold on a cliff face. Then she walked out into the dark, and the door closed behind her, and Dusty Hollow swallowed her whole. The night had no mercy in it. Walked without direction at first, moved purely by the animal instinct to keep moving, because stopping meant the cold would win, and the cold was already winning. The wind came in long, sweeping gusts across the open plain, cutting through her thin shawl as though it were paper, pressing against her pregnant belly with a cruelty that felt almost personal. The dirt road out of Dusty Hollow stretched ahead of her in the darkness, pale and faintly luminous under a half-moon that gave light but no warmth whatsoever. She had perhaps a quarter-mile behind her when the first cramp came. It was not the dull, familiar ache of a tired back or swollen feet. This was something lower and more deliberate, a slow iron fist closing somewhere deep inside her. Stopped walking. She pressed one hand against her belly and stood perfectly still in the middle of the frozen road, breathing through her nose the way the midwife had told her, counting silently until the pressure eased. When it passed, she exhaled a cloud of white breath into the darkness and kept walking. She told herself it was nothing, false pains, common enough at 7 months. She told herself this 3 more times over the next 20 minutes, each time less convincingly than the last. She had no destination. The town was behind her, and returning to it meant facing neighbors who had already heard Ida's poisonous rumors, a reverend who preached mercy on Sundays and practiced convenience the rest of the week, and a cold church floor that was only marginally better than the road she was already on. Ahead of her was open country, frozen rangeland that stretched for miles before reaching anything resembling shelter. She thought distantly of the midwife's small house on the eastern edge of town. She thought of turning back. Then another cramp arrived, sharper this time, and the thought dissolved entirely. Sank to one knee at the roadside. The snow was thin on the ground, a brittle, hard-crusted layer that cracked beneath her like broken glass. She pressed her palm flat against it and felt the cold shoot straight up through her arm. The baby moved inside her, a slow, rolling shift that under any other circumstances would have made her smile. Tonight it terrified her. She was alone on a frozen road in the middle of a Texas night, 7 months pregnant, with no shelter, no help, and a body that was beginning to make decisions without consulting her. She did not hear the horse until it was almost upon her. The rider came fast from the north, hoofbeats muffled by the frozen ground until he crested the shallow rise in the road and his horse reared at the sight of her. A dark shape collapsed at the roadside, barely visible in the moonlight. The animal's front hooves came down hard just feet from where knelt, and she threw her arm up instinctively, shielding her face. "Whoa, whoa!" The rider's voice was deep, commanding, and immediate. He brought the horse under control with the practiced ease of a man who had spent more years in the saddle than out of it, dismounting before the animal had fully stilled. He was tall. That was the first thing registered, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy ranch coat that reached his knees, a dark hat pulled low against the wind. He crouched down beside her without hesitation, and in the thin moonlight she saw his face, sharp-jawed, weathered, somewhere in his mid-30s, with eyes that were assessing her with rapid, serious attention. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "I am fine," said, which was so obviously untrue that the man did not dignify it with a response. "Can you stand?" She tried. Her legs had stiffened in the cold, and the next cramp chose that precise moment to arrive with full force. She made a sound she had not intended to make, a sharp, bitten-off gasp, and the man's arm was around her shoulders before she had finished making it. "That's labor," he said flatly, "not a question." "It's early," managed. "It's happening," he replied, with the same calm practicality one might use to observe that it was raining. He was already moving, guiding her toward his horse with one arm steady around her. "My ranch is 12 minutes north. Can you ride?" She nodded, because the alternative was the road. He lifted her into the saddle with a careful, deliberate strength, ensuring she was settled and secure before swinging up behind her, one arm wrapped around her to hold her steady. He did not ask her name. He did not ask why she was alone on a frozen road in the middle of the night, 7 months gone with child. He simply turned the horse north and rode. His name, she would learn, was Elias Cane. Cane Ridge Estate rose out of the darkness like a promise, warm lamplight glowing in the windows of a large, well-built ranch house, surrounded by outbuildings, a substantial barn, and the dark shapes of fenced pastures stretching away in every direction. It was not the grandest house had ever seen, but on that particular night, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever looked upon in her life. Elias brought the horse to the front steps and called out before he had even dismounted, "Mama Bess." The front door opened within seconds, spilling warm golden light across the porch, and the woman who filled the doorframe was exactly the kind of woman that word mama had been invented to describe. Bess Tanner was 63 years old, broad and solid as a farmhouse herself, with silver hair pinned beneath a cotton cap and an expression that shifted from surprise to total competence in the span of a single breath. "Lord in heaven," Mama Bess said, taking its condition with one sweeping look. "Get her inside. I'll send Jacob for the midwife." "Already thinking it," Elias said. What followed was a blur of warmth and motion that experienced in fragments, the heat of a real fire hitting her frozen skin like a physical force, Mama Bess's capable hands removing her wet shawl and wrapping a heavy quilt around her shoulders, a bedroom with an actual bed and actual sheets, and a lamp burning steadily on the nightstand. Heard herself answering questions, her name, how far along, how long she had been outside, and heard her own voice as though from a slight distance, calm and functional even as her body staged its urgent, unstoppable event. The midwife arrived within the hour. By the time the storm outside had reached its full, howling peak, Holt had brought a son into the world. She named him Thomas James Holt II, and he arrived loud and indignant and perfectly healthy, and pressed her lips to his damp forehead and wept for the first time since she had stood beside a frozen grave in November and watched them cover his father. Elias waited in the hallway throughout. When Mama Bess opened the bedroom door and gave him a single nod, he released a breath he appeared to have been holding for quite some time. He did not go inside. He simply turned, walked to the kitchen, and put the coffee on because it was 4 in the morning, and there was nothing else a decent man could reasonably do. In the days that followed, recovered in the east bedroom of Cane Ridge Estate with the stubborn, quiet efficiency that had carried her through the last 3 months of her life, she nursed little Thomas, regained her strength, and with great care and considerable pride, began establishing exactly what her presence in Elias Cane's home was and was not. "I will not be a charity case," she told him on the third morning when he brought a breakfast tray to her door himself because Mama Bess's knees were troubling her. "I will work for my keep, whatever needs doing." Elias looked at her for a moment with those steady eyes. "You just gave birth in a snowstorm, Mrs. Holt." 4 days ago, said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the architectural suggestion of one, "Rest another week," he said. "Then we'll talk." It was the beginning of something, though neither of them would have called it that yet. Watched him from the window sometimes, riding out at first light to inspect his pastures, speaking quietly with his ranch hands, making decisions with a calm authority that carried no cruelty in it. She learned from Mama Bess that Elias had been engaged once, 5 years back, to a woman named Ruth who had taken a fever in the spring of 1882 and never recovered. That he had built the east bedroom, the room now occupied, for Ruth, and had not used it since. That he rode alone at night when sleep would not come, which was often. "He is a good man," Mama Bess told one afternoon, without particular emphasis, as though simply stating a geographic fact. "Just a lonely one." Said nothing, but she did not look away from the window. It was on the 9th day of her stay that she showed Elias the envelope. She had carried it so long, through grief, through the Holt farmhouse, through the frozen road and the storm and the birth, that handing it to another person felt like setting down a stone she had forgotten she was holding. She placed it on the kitchen table between them and told him what Thomas had said when he gave it to her. Elias opened it carefully. He read the deed first, then the letter. His expression did not change dramatically. It rarely did, but something shifted in his eyes, a deepening of attention that was beginning to recognize as his version of being moved. He set the letter down slowly. "That land borders my northern pasture," he said quietly. "I know," said. "There is something else." He looked at her steadily. "My father knew Thomas's father. Years back, Thomas's father pulled my father from a burning barn at considerable risk to himself. My father told me once he owed that family a debt he never properly repaid." He paused. "I think he meant to. He just ran out of time." Felt something shift inside her chest, not grief exactly, but something adjacent to it. The sense of connections made too late, of kindness that had traveled a long road to finally arrive. "Your land is good land, Mrs. Holt," Elias said. "Better than it looks." He did not explain what he meant by that, not yet. But that night, for the first time in months, Holt slept without dreaming of frozen roads. The trouble arrived on a Wednesday morning, wearing a badge. Deputy Wade rode up to Cane Ridge Estate just after breakfast, when the winter light was thin and pale across the yard, and little Thomas was sleeping in the warmth of the east bedroom. Heard the hoofbeats from the kitchen window and watched the deputy dismount with the slow, theatrical confidence of a man who believed his authority was larger than it actually was. He was thick through the middle, with a rust-colored mustache and small eyes that moved too quickly, the eyes of a man perpetually calculating an exit. Elias met him on the porch before he reached the steps. "Cane," Wade said, touching his hat with 2 fingers, "got legal business with the widow." "Then you can state it here," Elias replied, "in front of me." Wade's small eyes flickered with irritation, but he produced a folded document from inside his coat with the practiced flourish of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "Got papers here signed by Earl Holt, filed at the county office. Says the deed transfer Thomas Holt made to this woman was signed under duress and is hereby contested. Woman's required to surrender the original deed pending a hearing." Had come to the doorway. She stood straight, Thomas's warm weight sleeping somewhere behind her, the cold morning air pressing against her face. She looked at the document in Wade's hand and felt something harden inside her chest, not fear, but a quiet, absolute refusal. "May I see it?" Elias said. It was not a question. Wade hesitated, then handed it over. Elias read it with the unhurried attention of a man who read contracts the way other men read weather, looking for what was hidden beneath the surface. After a long moment he looked up. "This," he said calmly, "is dated November 3rd. "That's right," Wade said. "Thomas Holt died October 19th. Elias folded the document with quiet precision. "This paper was notarized by a dead man's hand, deputy. That is not a legal document. That is evidence of fraud." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a bluff being called in front of witnesses. Two ranch hands had drifted to the edge of the yard. Mama Bess stood in the doorway behind, arms crossed, expression unreadable and devastating. Wade's mustache twitched. "Now see here." "I will see Judge," Elias said. "This afternoon. You are welcome to ride ahead and let Earl Holt know we are coming." Judge Clarence held court in the back room of the Dusty Hollow Land Office, a small, wood-paneled room that smelled of pipe tobacco and old paper, heated by a cast-iron stove that ticked and popped through the proceedings. By 2 o'clock that afternoon it was standing room only, because Dusty Hollow was a small town and small towns treated justice like theater, which, on this particular Wednesday, it very nearly was. Earl and Ida sat on one side of the room, Earl's thick jaw set hard, Ida's hands folded in her lap with the rigid composure of a woman holding herself together through sheer force of contempt. Wade stood near the door. Reverend Dawson hovered at the back, having apparently decided that proximity to a courtroom was close enough to moral engagement. Sat beside Elias at the small table before the judge, her spine straight, little Thomas bundled and sleeping in Mama Bess's capable arms in the front row. Judge examined the forged document over the rim of his spectacles for a long, deliberate moment. He was 70, spare and dry as old timber, with a reputation for patience that had a hard floor to it. "Mr. Holt," he said finally, looking at Earl, "this carries the stamp of clerk, yet clerk has confirmed to me this morning that he stamped no such document in November, and that his stamp was reported missing from his office for 3 days in early December." He set the paper down. "Would you like to revise your testimony before we proceed further?" Earl's jaw worked silently. Ida stared at the wall. It was then that Mama Bess stood up. The room shifted its attention to her the way rooms do when someone stands with genuine authority rather than performed authority. She reached into the pocket of her apron and produced a folded piece of paper that had gone soft at the creases from years of careful keeping. "Your Honor," she said, in a voice that carried without effort, "I was present 17 years ago when Cane, Elias' father, made a sworn promise to Daniel Holt, Thomas's father, in repayment of a debt of life. Daniel Holt asked only one thing: that the Cane family would bear witness to any legal matter concerning his son's inheritance, should it ever come into question." She placed the paper on the judge's table. "Cane signed that agreement. I witnessed it. This is my copy." The room was absolutely still. Judge read the document twice. Then he removed his spectacles, polished them with his handkerchief, and replaced them with the deliberate ceremony of a man organizing his thoughts. "The deed stands," he said. "The 40 acres are the lawful property of Mrs. Holt." He looked at Earl over his spectacles with an expression that contained no warmth whatsoever. "Furthermore, the matter of a pregnant widow being expelled from shelter in below-freezing temperatures will be addressed as a separate civil complaint. I suggest you both retain counsel." Ida made a small, strangled sound. Earl stared at the floor. Released a breath she felt she had been holding since October. It was Elias who found her afterward, standing alone at the edge of the land office porch, while the town buzzed and dispersed around them. The afternoon light had softened into the particular gold of a winter sun making its best effort, and it caught the angles of his face in a way that made Elias stop walking for just a moment before he continued toward her. They stood side by side in silence for a time, looking out at the dusty main street of Dusty Hollow, the town that had swallowed her whole on a frozen night not 2 months past. "You are a woman of independent means now," Elias said quietly. "That spring beneath your land, I had a surveyor confirm it last week. Fresh water, consistent flow. In this county, that is worth more than cattle." Nodded slowly. She had known, in some abstract way, that the ground had shifted beneath her life. She simply had not yet fully measured how far. "You don't need Cane Ridge anymore," Elias continued. His voice was steady, but something underneath it was not. You don't need anyone's roof or anyone's charity or anyone's. He stopped, started again. I want to say something, and I need to say it plainly because I am not a man who is particularly gifted at anything else. Turned to look at him. His eyes met hers directly. None of the careful, managed distance she had watched him maintain for weeks. Just the unguarded truth of a man standing at the edge of something and deciding to step forward regardless. "I'm not saying this because you need help," he said. "I am saying it because every morning for the past 6 weeks I have found a reason to walk past the east bedroom door just to hear you and Thomas in there. Because Mama Bess hums when she is happy and she has not stopped humming since you arrived. Because that house was a quiet, well-managed, thoroughly empty place before you, and I did not understand how empty until it wasn't anymore." He paused. "I love you. That is the plain truth of it. And I would very much like the chance to say it for the rest of my life, if you'll allow me." Looked at him for a long moment, this serious, steady, quietly tender man who had lifted her from a frozen road, without asking a single question, who had stood beside her before a judge without hesitation, who put the coffee on at 4 in the morning because it was the decent thing to do. "You are not a man gifted at speeches," she confirmed. "No," he agreed. "That was still a good one," she said. And she took his hand. Spring came to Dusty Hollow the way it always does in Texas. Suddenly and without apology, the frozen plains softening almost overnight into something green and breathing and full of possibility. By April, the 40 acres north of Cane Ridge were fenced and surveyed, the water spring properly channeled, and the whole arrangement was thriving in a way that made the county surveyor shake his head with something between admiration and envy. And Elias were married on the first Saturday of April, in a small ceremony in the yard of Cane Ridge Estate, with Mama Bess weeping with uncomplicated joy in the front row, and little Thomas James Holt II sleeping through the entire proceeding in the arms of a ranch hand, who had lost a considerable bet about whether the boss would ever remarry. The reverend who performed the ceremony was not Reverend Dawson, who had quietly relocated to another county sometime in February. This reverend was younger, traveled, and said what he meant, which suited everyone present perfectly well. In the final photograph taken that afternoon, by a traveling photographer who had arrived in Dusty Hollow entirely by coincidence, and considered it the finest commission of his career, stood on the porch of Cane Ridge Estate in a simple cream dress, Thomas in her arms, Elias beside her with his hand in hers, and the particular expression of a man who has stopped riding alone at night because he has finally found a reason to come home. Behind them, the estate stretched wide and green and alive. Ahead of them, the spring light fell across 40 flourishing acres that a good man had quietly signed over to the woman he loved before he crossed a river and did not come back. A final act of foresight and devotion that had traveled through grief and frozen roads and a winter storm to deliver his, and his son, and an unexpected future, into exactly the right hands. The cold hearth was warm now, and it would stay that way.